Les gens, les boxeurs comme style, c'est très agressif. Ils ont toujours ces t-shirts un peu à la Tyson, là, des shorts du four, un petit peu.
When I say you must obey, just like the both of you took my
Et là, Maïva, c'est son milieu.
Ouais, le crochet. Magnifique shot.
Ah, c'est un vrai coup au corps.
Et ouais, le crochet au foie, il a touché.
Là, c'est un vrai coup au corps.
Pendant Bigouan,
Ouais,
encore
pas
un rouge.
au corps.
Allez, très dur là, qui a arrêté.
Oui, forcément, elle remet un genou au sol.
Et elle regarde son point. Ça va dans tous les sens, la part des deux boxeuses. Et tout ça par du bon point. Et la touche par du bon point. Elle a du mal, Viviane.
Et elle a du mal à récupérer.
Okay, we'll start with this. Well, Eddie Hearn has hopes to stage Usyk versus Chisora in October, and he's optimistic that revised terms can be agreed. We're close, Hearn told Sky Sports. I mean, both guys understand that without a gate at the O2, there's significantly less revenue driven to that show. But both guys fancy the fight. We're trying to get the maths right. We're trying to get the numbers right to get these guys over the line. I have to say fair play to both of them. They are trying to find a way. Usyk is saying to me, Chisora is saying to me, David Hay phones me all the time. Let's find a way to make this fight. It's great for boxing. You know, I really didn't know what the state of this fight was. Consider that we've already got the date for Dillian White versus Alexander Povetkin 2, and yet this fight still has terms that need to be ironed out. Though it is encouraging that, at least according to Eddie Hearn, both guys want the fight and they understand the sacrifices they have to make in order to get things done, because we're not back to normal yet. You know, crowds are returning to boxing in certain parts of the world. A small card in Germany a couple of weeks ago had a very small audience in attendance. We know that in the land down under, Australia, the fight between Tszyu and Jeff Harn had a rather sizable crowd in attendance for that card. The most sizable crowd we've seen since this whole COVID thing started. I mean, we're getting there, but it's baby steps, and it's not across the board. In the UK, big crowds have not returned to boxing yet, and in October, well, they still might not. It might be too soon. Pretty much everybody's been playing the waiting game with this thing, waiting to see if crowds would return to boxing so that revenue stream would be there for certain fights. But, you know, we're approaching the fall. We're closer to the end of the year now than the beginning, and audiences really aren't all the way back. So what are you going to do? You're going to sacrifice more of your time playing that waiting game, or are you going to say, fuck it, bite the bullet, make the sacrifice to get out there and get something done? Because I'll tell you, not everybody playing the waiting game can actually afford to sit on their hands. Don't think that that's coming at no cost at all. It is. It is coming at the cost of time. Time which could come at the cost of performance. You want to get out there and have to shake off ring rust in a big fight, an even bigger fight than this fight? Let me tell you something. Usyk needs this Chisora fight to get over the line. He really does. Because the Joshua fight is right around the corner. Okay, Joshua is very close to taking care of his mandatory challenger, his IBF mandatory challenger, Kubrat Pulev. Whereas Usyk, he hasn't dealt with Derek Chisora yet. So you hypothesize that, hypothetically speaking, the Chisora fight doesn't happen. They don't get it over the line. That would then have to mean that Usyk would have gone from fighting the very unheralded Chaz Witherspoon straight into the Anthony Joshua fight in 2021. Ladies and gentlemen, there's over a year's time, there would be over a year's time in between both of those fights, and that wouldn't bode very well for Alexander Usyk, so he needs to get this thing done. He needs to fight Derek Chisora.
He's got to make that sacrifice.
It's not just about what he stands to make from the Derek Chisora fight, it's also about the preparation necessary to fully acclimate to this weight class. Usyk's only had one fight as a heavyweight, and it was against an unheralded guy. That's not the kind of preparation he needs to fight Anthony Joshua. He's going to need someone a little bit more lively, a little bit more dedicated, a little bit more experienced. And that's Derek Chisora. That's why this fight and this sacrifice is a necessary evil, even if it comes at the cost of the live gate revenue. Granted that you don't stand to make now for this fight what you stood to make then, but that doesn't mean you don't need it. Now, I am not castigating or chastising either the Usyk people or the Chisora people for having played the waiting game. It's just that the time for that game is over, and it's time to get back out there. It's time to have a fight. The situation was very immaterial, evolving. We didn't know what condition the world was going to be in once the fall and winter months roll around. But now that those months are approaching, well, we can say that the crowds aren't back yet. So how long do you want to sit out, and how much time are you willing to sacrifice playing that waiting game? But we see that the White versus Povetkin fight has come and gone. There was no audience in attendance. We see that the Vasyl Lomachenko versus Teofimo Lopez fight, a sizable fight, sizable value. That fight is on its way, and there won't be a crowd in attendance for that either. On the PBC side of things, there are several pay-per-views set to go down in the very near future. The Spence versus Garcia fight, the Charlo doubleheader, and these are pay-per-views that won't have a massive audience in attendance.
Nope.
Everybody's making sacrifices because the market, the entire market, has changed. So much so that, you know what? You can't afford to wait to get out there anymore. As a fight fan, I'd obviously like to see this fight get over the line sooner rather than later, but it's not just the fight fans that the fighters and the powers that be have to consider. It's also their condition as athletes. You want to be in peak physical condition when it's time to take on Anthony Joshua. You don't want to have to shake off cobwebs or ring rust. You don't need a lengthy stint of inactivity between the Chaz Witherspoon fight and the Anthony Joshua fight. Thus, this fight with Derek Chisora, it needs to happen, and it needs to happen sooner rather than later. In junior middleweight news, Tszyu's return is being targeted for December, and there are a few names in play. We know that Tszyu and his team had hopes of challenging the WBO's junior middleweight champion, Patrick Teixeira of Brazil, but apparently the WBO is not allowing Patrick to circumvent his mandatory obligation to his mandatory challenger, Argentina's Brian Castaño. So Tim, he's going to have to look for other things to do against other opponents. There are 3 names in play. 2 are quite familiar. Dennis Hogan, who we saw against Jaime Munguia and gave Jaime all he could handle, though he was subsequently stopped in the middleweight division by the very statuesque Jermall Charlo. There is the name of Michael Zarafa, who has locked horns with anyone from Kell Brook to Jeff Horn. Certainly gave Jeff Horn a hard time in both of those fights, though Jeff did manage to avenge the loss in the rematch. And there is
Also
the name of Daniel Lewis, who beat Tszyu in the amateurs in a youth title fight in 2011. Lewis lost to the undefeated and very statuesque Sebastian Fundora. If I'm being honest, I take no issue with any of the aforementioned names. Dennis Hogan, Daniel Lewis, Michael Zarafa. They're interchangeable as far as I'm concerned. Though I will say, I do think Dennis Hogan is likelier to get the fight than, say, Michael Zarafa. I also think Daniel Lewis is likelier to get the fight than Michael Zarafa. All 3 of these guys are coming off of losses, you know. Michael Zarafa's coming off that loss to Jeff Horn last year. Dennis Hogan is coming off of 2 consecutive losses, though one was quite controversial. Some question whether it was a loss at all. The knockout loss to Jermall Charlo in the middleweight division, and before that, the controversial decision loss to the then WBO junior middleweight champion, Jaime Munguia. Daniel Lewis, who we mentioned earlier, is coming off that loss to the very statuesque Sebastian Fundora, which is why more or less these names are interchangeable to me. It's just that given Dennis Hogan's method of operation, that he's a smaller guy, lower center of gravity, very scrappy.
he is.
Scrappy like Jeff Horn is a rather scrappy guy. I think that perhaps Dennis or Daniel will get the fight. I've no critiques about these 3 opponent choices, these 3 options, because you got to remember what these guys wanted to do. They wanted to shoot for the WBO title. They wanted to challenge Patrick Teixeira, but the WBO won't let them. So this is basically just mean in between time kind of stuff. These are mean in between time kind of opponents. Tszyu is riding high off of his one-sided victory over Jeff Horn. He could very well become the face of Australian boxing in the very near future. And these opponent options accent his ability to do this. If he goes in there and he knocks Dennis Hogan's block off, where Jaime Munguia languished with the guy, struggled with him, if Tim can dispatch that guy easier than Jaime, well, that does lend itself to Tim Tszyu's stock, as this will be at a prescribed weight that is better for Dennis than that fight with Jermall Charlo was. That fight with Jermall Charlo was in the middleweight division. Dennis Hogan ain't no goddamn middleweight. Junior middleweight, that's a better weight for him. And at junior middleweight, he gave Jaime Munguia all he could handle. So what if, at junior middleweight, Tim Tszyu batters Dennis Hogan the way he just battered Jeff Horn? That certainly would lend itself to his overall stock and marquee value. The second choice, Daniel Lewis, Tim Tszyu's amateur rival, that guy's got a professional record of 6 wins and 1 loss. 7 professional fights total. That is yet another ideal choice in this situation, because in this situation, you want to participate in an interesting fight, a mildly interesting fight against a mildly interesting opponent. Not an opponent so interesting that you might be biting off more that you can chew. I think that the Tim Tszyu people are biding their time until they can fight for the WBO title. So these are basically just keep busy fights with keep busy guys. Seems that 2020 wasn't a complete wash for Tim Tszyu the way it was for some other fighters out there. He's getting things done. He had a rather sizable fight against Jeff Horn, and now he's set to come back before the year is out against a familiar face, no less. Not just a familiar face to Australian boxing, but on the world stage, the world level, to some degree, as we have seen Dennis Hogan and Michael Zarafa challenge world level guys. So it's a solid plan, and I like how they're moving this kid. I think he's set to do big things, and not just because of his last name, but because he's got the skills to pay the bills. I look forward to seeing Tim Tszyu's next outing. And finally, per a tweet from Michael Benson, DAZN reportedly prefer for Daniel Jacobs to face John Ryder over Gabriel Rosado on November 27th or the 28th because they are still planning to launch in the United Kingdom later this year. It's claimed Murodjan Akhmadaliev, unified champion Murodjan Akhmadaliev versus Ryosuke Uwasa is also possible for this show, according to Boxing Scene. And it seems that the people over there at DAZN have the same preferences that I do, as I have no interest in seeing Daniel Jacobs lock horns with Gabriel Rosado in spite of their verbal exchanges as of late. A fighter like Daniel Jacobs has nothing to prove and nothing to gain from fighting the likes of a Gabriel Rosado, and that's not a knock on Gabe. I respect the hell out of the guy, but I'm not interested in seeing that fight. Now, if you want to get me interested in a Gabriel Rosado fight, you put him in there with Jaime Munguia, you stage the goddamn thing in the middleweight division, where Jaime Munguia has a lot to prove and a lot of stripes to earn. Against a Gabriel Rosado, that's actually an interesting matchup. But against Danny ain't got nothing to prove to that guy. Now, Danny might have something to prove to the likes of a John Ryder. John Ryder, who some people happen to think beat Callum Smith in his last outing. Callum Smith, the Ring Magazine and WBA super middleweight champion. I've been telling you guys for weeks, I'd rather see Danny fight that guy and prove something against that guy than anybody else. That if he can't lock horns with Billy and he can't lock horns with Callum straight away, I could really go for a John Ryder fight. The name of Daniel Jacobs still has a lot of added value to it because this is a fighter who stopped Peter Quillen in 1 round. This is a fighter who gave Gennady Golovkin all he could handle at that time, and this is a fighter who locked horns with Canelo Alvarez in a rather interesting matchup of champions. That's right. Lest we forget, Daniel Jacobs is the former IBF middleweight champion, and he still goes out there and puts on performances that are entertaining. That Julio Cesar Chavez fight looked like it was going to really heat up until Julio decided to quit, but that's hardly Daniel Jacobs' fault. I could go for a Daniel Jacobs versus Callum Smith fight, Daniel Jacobs versus Billy Joe Saunders fight, and if the prelude to those fights at 168 pounds has to be John Ryder, then so be it. It's the ideal fight for DAZN to dip their toe in the pool of the United Kingdom's boxing community, as that is a community that's already familiar with Daniel Jacobs due to the Golovkin fight, due to the Canelo fight, and they're already familiar with John Ryder because of the Callum Smith fight. It's an ideal situation. This news
It's interesting.
of DAZN going ahead with their plans to tap into the UK market kind of goes against many of the narratives we've been seeing as of late from the usual suspects, that DAZN is in all this trouble and it's a sinking ship. Well, I don't think that a sinking ship would still have the means, the money, and the resources to try to tap into another foreign market. I mean, just a week or so ago, you were hearing the usual suspects tell you that Canelo Alvarez would single-handedly bankrupt DAZN, and not but a few days later, you hear that the guy's case is dismissed, at least temporarily, because he didn't get the legalese right. These guys, they swore up and down this was it. This would be the undoing of DAZN's venture into the American market, and just like that, that narrative was shot to shit. I don't understand why anybody goes to those guys for information. I don't know why anyone would go to those guys for news.
Guys suck, bro.
I do think it's disturbing how easy it is these days to spread false information. But what's even more disturbing than that is how easily people buy into said false information, said misinformation. These guys don't even want to know the reality of things. They don't actually want to know the truth, otherwise they do the research themselves. These guys actually want to be lied to. I mean, you don't have to be Perry Mason to know that a company like DAZN, a global company more or less, with their finger in several pies throughout several different regions, different territories around the world, you ain't gotta be Perry Mason, a Maclock, to know that a company like that knows how to cover their ass in a contract. These guys, they buy into these narratives, and they buy into these narratives not because they're possible or plausible, but based solely on who the news is coming from. It's not the news themselves they buy into so much as the individual. In this instance, the spin doctors, the propaganda peddlers, so on and so forth. But I'll tell you, a company that you would characterize as a sinking ship is not a company that would have the means and the resources to expand their area of operations to the United Kingdom. Not if it's the way that you guys say it is, the way the people at DAZN ain't got a pot to piss in, and they're supposedly on the verge of collapse. They're on the verge of bankruptcy. So listen, you guys out there, you can lie to yourselves as much as you want, but what you can't do is lie to me.